Moscow, October 1952. Kuntsevo Dacha. The cough started as a whisper. At first it was nothing, a dry irritation that came and went with the smoke of his pipe. But by October, it had settled into Stalin's chest like an unwelcome guest. He sat in his armchair by the window, a thick wool blanket over his knees. The forest outside was still, the birch trees pale and motionless under the gray sky. His pipe rested cold on the ashtray. He stared at it for a long time before speaking. "Bring me the doctor," he said quietly. The guard nodded, stepped out. Minutes later, Professor Vinogradov, one of Stalin's oldest physicians, entered the room. A thin man, careful with his words. His hands trembled slightly as he unpacked the stethoscope. "Breathe deeply, Comrade General Secretary," he said. Stalin obeyed once, then stopped. His eyes narrowed. "You are nervous, doctor." Vinogradov swallowed. "Only concerned for your health, comrade." "Concern is good," Stalin said, "but fear is better. It keeps a man alert." The doctor said nothing. He listened to the heartbeat, counted the breaths. Nothing seemed fatal, just age, exhaustion, decades of tobacco and tension. But when he began to speak, Stalin cut him off. "You think I'm dying?" "No, comrade. I think you should rest more." "Rest," Stalin repeated. "When every enemy waits for me to close my eyes?" He smiled faintly. It wasn't humor. Vinogradov hesitated, then stepped back, bowing his head slightly. "As you wish, Comrade General Secretary." When the doctor left, Stalin remained still for a long time. The ticking clock in the corner filled the silence. Then he stood, slow and deliberate, and walked to his desk. He opened a drawer and pulled out a single page, a report from the MGB, marked confidential. Rumors persist of Western agents infiltrating Moscow medical institutions. Several doctors show suspicious contact with foreign embassies. He read it twice, then again. The cough returned, harsher this time. He gripped the edge of the desk until his knuckles went white. Foreign agents, Jewish conspirators, traitors in white coats. The idea had been whispered before, years ago. Now it came alive again in his mind, sharp and personal. He pressed the bell. A guard appeared instantly. "Call Ignatiev," Stalin said, "from State Security." "Tonight." The guard nodded and left. Stalin leaned over the report once more, the cough shaking his shoulders. He felt the tremor of age in his hands and despised it. Weakness invited betrayal. Weakness meant death. By the time Ignatiev arrived, Stalin's decision was made. "Comrade," Stalin said, handing him the report, "I want names. I want every doctor who touches the leadership's pulse investigated. Quietly. No noise. We'll see which of them are healers and which are executioners." Ignatiev nodded, his face pale. Outside, the forest was black now. The lights from the dacha glowed faintly in the mist. Inside, Stalin poured himself a glass of tea. He watched the steam rise and whispered to no one in particular, "They think they can poison me." He sipped, eyes fixed on the darkness. The cough came again, low, dry, unending. And in that sound, suspicion took root. The files began to multiply like a sickness. By December, Stalin's desk was buried under them. reports, testimonies, unsigned notes. Every one of them spoke of doctors, and everyone whispered the same thing: plot, sabotage, poisoning. The investigation had a rhythm now: slow, deliberate, inevitable. Comrade Ignatiev from State Security came every evening, carrying new folders bound in red string. He always looked tired. His voice trembled when he spoke. "Comrade General Secretary," he began one night, "we've obtained confessions. A group of doctors, Kremlin physicians, admitting to deliberate mistreatment of high-ranking officials. They claim to have been guided by Zionist organizations and Western intelligence." Stalin didn't look up. He sat behind his desk, pipe in hand, eyes fixed on the smoke rising from the bowl. "Names?" he asked. Ignatiev opened the top file. Vinogradov, Kogan, Feldman, Ettinger. The pencil in Stalin's hand tapped twice against the table. "Vinogradov," he repeated softly. "My own physician." Ignatiev nodded carefully. "He denies everything, but the others—" "Others talk because they are weak," Stalin interrupted. "Weakness is betrayal." He stood, began pacing slowly across the room. The lamplight caught the edge of his profile, sharp, gray, tired. "He looked at me," Stalin said after a long pause. "When he listened to my chest." His hands trembled. "I saw it then. He knows something." Ignatiev stayed silent. He had learned not to interrupt. Stalin stopped pacing and turned toward the window. Beyond it, the Kremlin towers were faint shapes in the frozen dark. "You understand, comrade," Stalin said quietly. "This isn't just about doctors. It's about enemies hiding in plain sight, people who pretend to heal but serve another master." "Yes, Comrade General Secretary." "Good." He sat again, picked up the topmost folder, and flipped it open. Typed lines, official stamps, careful language, all blending truth with paranoia until even the paper felt contaminated. He read a paragraph aloud. "Patient, Zhdanov, received improper cardiac treatment. Evidence suggests intentional negligence leading to premature death." Stalin's mouth twitched. "Zhdanov," he muttered. "My old friend. They killed him too." He closed the file and reached for his pencil. He wrote one word in the margin: "Verify." It didn't matter that Zhdanov had died years before. What mattered was the story, and how well it fit the shape of Stalin's fear. That night, as Ignatiev left the office, Stalin remained alone. He poured himself tea again, though he never drank it. On the corner of the desk sat a small photograph, a group picture from 1935. Stalin surrounded by party leaders, Zinoviev among them, long dead now. He stared at the photo for a moment, tracing faces with his eyes. "So many traitors," he whispered, "and yet I kept inviting them back." He smiled, a thin, mirthless curve. The cough returned, harsh and persistent. He pressed a handkerchief to his mouth, stared at the red stains spreading into the fabric. "Poison," he muttered. "Slow poison." He looked toward the empty chair across the room, as if addressing someone unseen. "They're everywhere," he said, "even the ones who bring medicine." Then he stood, walked to the door, and locked it. No one saw the lights go out. But by morning, 4 new names were added to the investigation list. and every doctor who served the Kremlin began to count the hours, waiting for a knock that would come before dawn. January 1953. Lubyanka Prison. They came before dawn. Always before dawn. The sound began the same way each time. Boots on the stairwell, the metallic knock, the pause. Then the door would open, and silence would swallow the apartment behind them. By mid-January, the corridors of Lubyanka were full again. Doctors, professors, even nurses. The men who once carried stethoscopes now carried bruises. They were accused of killing heroes, of poisoning the protectors of the revolution, of conspiring against the man who called himself its father. But no one dared speak Stalin's name inside those interrogation rooms. It hung in the air like smoke, heavy, toxic, unspoken. Professor Vinogradov was brought in first. His hands were tied, his eyes hollow from sleeplessness. He had been questioned for 3 nights already. This morning they asked him again, "Who ordered you to poison the leadership?" "I'm a doctor," he whispered. "I treated them. I didn't kill them." The interrogator smiled thinly. "Then why are there reports? Why do your colleagues confess?" Vinogradov looked up. His lips trembled. "They confess because you break them." The interrogator leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You think you're smarter than the General Secretary? He already knows the truth. He's given us the names." That silenced him. Because in Stalin's world, if the leader already knew, there was no truth left to defend. In his Kremlin office, Stalin received the daily updates. He read every interrogation summary, every confession. Some were written in faint, broken handwriting, words forced between beatings and fear. He underlined sentences, added notes in the margins. Continue questioning. Useful. Confirm connections. Each line fed his conviction. The doctors were plotting, and he, once again, had seen what others could not. Yet the more he read, the more the sickness inside him deepened. The cough had worsened. His chest burned. He refused further treatment, convinced his body was under siege. "Tell Beria," he ordered, "no more Jewish doctors. Not one. Replace them all. Check their families too." "Yes, Comrade General Secretary." He watched his aides scribble notes, eyes darting nervously toward him. He could smell their fear, sharp and familiar. At night, when the coughing fits came, he'd stare at the ceiling and mutter, "They tried to kill me." The guards outside could hear him talking to himself, sometimes laughing, sometimes not. Inside Lubyanka, the interrogations grew crueler. The doctors broke one by one, saying anything that might stop the pain. "I received orders from abroad. I was recruited by Zionists. Yes, I poisoned them." Each signature added weight to Stalin's belief. Each broken confession gave shape to the enemy he needed. But there was one man who didn't confess. Dr. Boris Kogan. When they brought his file to Stalin, the dictator frowned. "Stubborn," he said. "Good. Let's see how long he lasts." He set the file aside and turned toward the dark window. Snow was falling again, barely visible against the glass. "They all think I'm old," he murmured, "that I can't see. But I see everything. He smiled faintly, as if reassuring himself. By the end of January, the doctor's plot had a full list of conspirators. Letters were drafted, statements prepared, articles waiting to be published. The public would soon be told that the motherland's enemies had been unmasked, a network of physicians plotting to murder Soviet heroes. Inside his dacha at Kuntsevo, Stalin sat alone, reading the final report. He whispered the last line aloud. The investigation continues under the personal supervision of Comrade Stalin. He liked how that sounded. He leaned back, closing his eyes. For a moment, he felt the world tighten in his grasp again. Then the cough returned, harsh, unstoppable, echoing in the stillness. He reached for his handkerchief, red. He looked at it and smiled. "Not yet," he whispered. "Not yet." By February, Stalin no longer trusted the walls. He believed they listened. He believed they breathed. Sometimes, he even believed they laughed. The nights were long in the Kuntsevo Dacha. The lights in the windows burned past midnight, but no sound came from inside except the slow shuffle of his steps and the dry rasp of his cough. He had dismissed most of the servants. Even the cook had been replaced twice in the same month. Food tasted strange lately, too salty, too bitter, too careful. At dinner, Stalin sat alone. The clock ticked. The fire popped. He chewed slowly, suspicious of every bite. When the cough struck, he covered his mouth with a napkin. Always the same red bloom. He stared at it each time, not with fear, but recognition. "They'll say it's illness," he muttered to himself, "but it's them." The doctors, still working. He laughed softly, a humorless cough disguised as a chuckle. In the mornings, reports still arrived from the MGB. He read them through a magnifying glass now. His eyes had grown weaker, his hands slower. Each page told him what he already believed. More arrests, more confessions, more proof that his enemies were everywhere. He would underline words that didn't need underlining. He would write notes that no one could read, but everyone feared. Once, Beria came to see him. He entered the study carefully, hat in hand, head slightly bowed. "Comrade General Secretary," he began, "the investigation is complete. We have full confessions from the doctors. It is ready for trial." Stalin didn't answer right away. He kept staring at the folder in front of him. Then, in a slow voice, "Confessions are words. I want truth. They all admit guilt, comrade." "Yes," Stalin said, "because they know what happens if they don't." He smiled faintly. "Fear is the best medicine." Beria hesitated. "Shall I proceed with the announcements?" Stalin looked up, his gaze sharp and colorless. "No, not yet. Let them wait. Let them sweat." He turned back to the window. The garden outside was a field of ice. "I'll decide when the people should know their doctors are traitors." Beria nodded, bowed, and left quickly. After he was gone, Stalin sat in silence. The air in the room felt heavy, stale. He could hear the faint hum of the telephone line. Or perhaps he only imagined it. He poured himself tea, but didn't drink it. Instead, he reached for the photograph again, the same one he had kept on his desk for years. Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, Trotsky, all gone now. He traced their faces with a shaking finger. "You all thought I wouldn't last," he whispered. "You all thought you could outlive me." The clock struck midnight. He didn't move. Sometimes, when the night grew too quiet, he would imagine their voices, Zinoviev's nasal speeches, Bukharin's pleading tone. He would hear them as though they were still in the next room, whispering plans, laughing at him. And each time he would whisper back, almost gently, "I'm still here." That night, as the snow thickened against the Dacha windows, Stalin wrote a short note in his own hand. No one saw it but him. It said, "Enemies among healers. Punish all. No mercy." He placed it inside a folder labeled "Doctor's Plot" for final decision. Then he sat back, his eyes closing, his breath shallow but steady. Outside, the forest stood silent, dark, and loyal. Inside, the man who ruled half the world sat in his chair, alone, suspicious, unguarded for the first time in decades. He didn't know it yet, but this would be his last winter. Kuntsevo Dacha, Moscow, March 1st, 1953. The night began like any other. Too quiet, too heavy. The guards outside the Kuntsevo Dacha spoke in whispers, the way men do when silence feels dangerous. Inside, the lights still burned. Stalin had been awake for hours, reading, pacing, coughing. Around midnight, he called for tea and wine. No one moved until the order came twice. When the tray finally arrived, he waved the servant away with a flick of his fingers. He poured the tea himself, slow and deliberate, watching the steam twist upward. He had spent the evening reviewing more Doctor's Plot files, Vinogradov's final confession, Kogan's forced admission, the forged letters suggesting British contact. All nonsense, yet all true because he believed it. He had won again. Everyone was guilty except him. Past 1 a.m, his body began to betray him. A faint pressure in his chest, a numbness in his hand. He ignored it. He always did. But as he stood to reach for another file, his vision blurred. The room tilted slightly. The tea spilled. His knees struck the carpet. For a few seconds, he tried to rise. The breath came shallow and strange. No sound escaped his mouth, only a low groan, more animal than human. The clock read 1:15 a.m. Then the great dictator of the Soviet Union, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, collapsed beside his desk, half his body paralyzed, one hand clutching the edge of the table as though trying to pull himself back into power. The guards outside waited. The light in his study stayed on, as always. No one dared knock. Hours passed. At dawn, when the cook arrived and found the general secretary lying on the floor, they hesitated to enter. No one was allowed to disturb Stalin while he slept. Even dead silence could be mistaken for treason. It wasn't until after 10 a.m. that someone finally opened the door. He was lying on his side, eyes half open, breathing shallow. His right hand was clenched around a piece of paper, crumpled, wet with sweat. When they pried it free, they found his handwriting. Just one word: punish. The doctors were summoned, not the old ones, of course, but the new ones, chosen after the Purge. They entered trembling, unsure whether they were there to save a man or to die beside him. They diagnosed a cerebral hemorrhage. They prescribed calm. But there was no calm in that house. Beria arrived first, pretending sorrow, already calculating the next move. Malenkov followed, pale and uncertain. They whispered by the door, each watching the other's hands. No one touched the papers on the desk. No one mentioned the files about the doctors. They just stood in that dim room, listening to Stalin's uneven breathing, waiting for history to decide its next shape. By evening, Stalin was still alive, but barely. His once commanding eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. The sound of his labored breath filled the room like a metronome marking the end of an era. Beria leaned over him at one point and whispered, "You see, Joseph Vissarionovich, even death waits for your permission." But Stalin didn't answer. For the first time in decades, he had nothing left to control. Outside, snow began to fall again, silent and steady. The guards didn't speak. The forest didn't move. And in the great house that once held the center of the Soviet world, power, like its master, was beginning to die in slow, uneven breaths. Moscow, March 5th, 1953. By the time the official announcement came, Stalin had been dead for hours. But in Moscow, time always moved at his command, even when he no longer breathed. At 9:50 p.m., the radio crackled with the voice of an announcer trying not to tremble. Comrade Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, the great leader and teacher of the Soviet people, has died after a grave illness. The words hung in the air like smoke. Outside, people froze where they stood. Some crossed themselves instinctively, then looked around in panic, realizing what they'd done. In the hospitals, in the factories, in the cramped communal kitchens of Moscow, silence spread like a second winter. In the Kremlin, fear and relief collided. Beria moved first. He strode through the halls with a new confidence, whispering orders, shaking hands that just days ago he would have condemned. Malenkov nodded and agreed to everything. Molotov stood still, his face unreadable, the face of a man who had once been Stalin's shadow, and now didn't know whether the sun was finally rising or just another trick of light. The first order Beria gave was simple: stop all investigations connected to the doctors. The doctors' plot, the grand conspiracy of Jewish physicians allegedly plotting to murder the Soviet leadership, was suddenly a mistake. A misunderstanding, they called it, a product of overzealous agencies. Every file that had been marked traitor now became error. Every confession extracted by torture became inadmissible. Men who had been beaten, humiliated, and sentenced to die were now quietly released, weak, limping, terrified. Some wept. Some didn't believe it. One whispered, "He's testing us again." In a small interrogation cell in Lubyanka, Dr. Boris Kogan was told he could go home. He stared at the officer blankly. "Home?" he repeated. I don't have one." His wife had died of grief the month before. His apartment was already assigned to another family. He stepped into the Moscow night wearing a prison coat and no hat. Snow fell on his hair like dust from another world. For him, Stalin wasn't dead. He was everywhere, in the walls, in the air, in the trembling of every passerby. Back in the dacha, Stalin's body lay surrounded by flowers. Guards stood at attention, eyes straight ahead, afraid to blink. Someone had tried to soften his features, to smooth the scowl that had frozen onto his face at death. It didn't work. Even in death, he looked suspicious, as if still judging those who dared to outlive him. A nurse whispered a prayer under her breath. Beria heard her. He didn't stop her. Because even he, for all his cunning, felt the ghost in the room. In the days that followed, millions came to see the body. They lined the streets for hours in the cold, weeping, fainting, collapsing. Some believed they were saying goodbye to a father. Others came only to make sure the tyrant was truly gone. But in the press releases, the slogans remained the same. Stalin lives in the heart of every Soviet citizen. In a way, it was true. His terror, his suspicion, his silence, they had become part of the people themselves. Even after the funeral, even after the flowers wilted and the radio switched to music again, no one spoke freely. No one laughed too loudly. No one forgot to look over their shoulder. Because Stalin might have died, but his fear was immortal. Moscow, spring 1953. The snow melted slow that year, as if even the weather wasn't sure how to behave without Stalin watching it. Across Moscow, the city stirred back to life. Trams clanged again, posters came down, whispers grew bolder. But for the men and women who had survived the doctor's plot, freedom did not feel like release. It felt like stepping into another cell, only one without walls. Dr. Boris Kogan walked the city in silence. His name had been cleared by the ministry, a single sentence in a back-page notice of Pravda. The investigation into the so-called doctor's conspiracy has been found baseless. That was it. No apology, no explanation, just a bureaucratic correction for the near destruction of his life. When he returned to the hospital on Herzen Street, his old office was gone. A younger man now sat at his desk, pretending not to recognize him. The nurses looked away, uneasy. One whispered, "I thought you were dead." He smiled faintly. So did I. He wasn't the only one. Dr. Miron Vovsi, Stalin's own physician and one of the chief accused, had been released only days earlier. He had lost weight, his hands trembled, but his mind remained sharp. They met once, quietly, in a small apartment kitchen that smelled of kerosene and fear. "You know," Vovsi said, staring into his glass of tea, "they told me I'd poisoned him. And when I said I hadn't, they told me I'd poisoned someone else." Kogan nodded. "And now?" Vovsi gave a thin smile. "Now, I suppose I cured him." They both laughed, softly, bitterly, like men laughing at a funeral long after the mourners have gone. Across the city, the propaganda machine reversed itself overnight. The same newspapers that had called the doctors enemies of the people now praised their devotion to Soviet medicine. No one mentioned the interrogations, the forced confessions, the dead. Even Beria spoke of reform. He released prisoners, reopened files, smiled for photographers. But everyone knew what he really wanted: power. and he would not live long enough to enjoy it. In May, a special ceremony was held at the Academy of Medical Sciences. The hall smelled of dust and disinfectant. Doctors in faded uniforms sat in silence as a party official read a statement. The late comrade Stalin was misinformed. Certain individuals exploited his trust. The motherland regrets these mistakes. No one clapped. No one moved. The official folded the paper, nodded stiffly, and left. The sound of his shoes faded down the marble corridor, leaving behind only the echo of what everyone knew. That nothing had changed except the name on the wall. That night, Dr. Kogan walked home through the city. Children played in the courtyards again. Someone was singing faintly from a balcony. He stopped and looked up at the Kremlin lights, still burning through the mist. For the first time in years, the light in Stalin's office window was dark. But even in that darkness, he could feel the weight of the man. A shadow stretched across the country, too deep for spring to wash away. He thought of the others still missing, of the names erased, of the files locked in drawers that no one dared open. Freedom, he realized, wasn't the end of fear. It was learning how to live with it. He turned, pulled his coat tighter, and walked into the night. Not as a doctor of the state anymore, but as a survivor of its sickness.